Hello and welcome to Unpacking Terms. The term we're going to unpack today is communicative competence. And what I'll present here is the simplified, abridged version of the work by Michael Canale, Sandra Savignon, and Meryl Swain. So what is communicative competence? The simplest way to describe it would be the components of underlying knowledge that affect or influence communication. And by that, we mean the interpretation and expression of meaning. Which components exactly? We will unpack each of them later in this video. There are three important qualities of communicative competence. First, it is context specific, as is communication. It depends on the situation, the participants, etc. Another important quality is that it's relative. It is not absolute. It's not something that we either have it fully or not at all. Savignon says that we should talk about degrees of communicative competence. And communicative competence is dynamic, it's not static. As Canale and Swain said, communication involves unpredictability and creativity. Before we unpack the components of communicative competence, let's clarify a few things. First, just a friendly reminder that communication is not just talking. And second, it's not just about getting your message across, not just about being understood with almost no concern for form. In fact, communicative competence encompasses what and how, which will be influenced by when, where, to whom, and why. So it is not just the what, but also the how. Something else to clarify is the word competence. Chomsky, along with others, distinguishes between competence, which would be knowledge, and performance, which would be actual use. Now, when we say knowledge, we don't necessarily mean explicit knowledge. Remember that knowledge can also be implicit. Not everyone thinks that this distinction is necessary, or at least not everyone sees it as a dichotomy. But since we're talking about communicative competence, we should clarify what some scholars mean by competence. One thing people may probably agree with is that performance is definitely observable. Competence, not so much. Is performance an application of competence? To some extent, yes, but it is not a direct and perfect application of it. Performance may be influenced by competence, but it is not a direct reflection of it. The earliest proposals of the term communicative competence were in the early 70s, and they stemmed from the need to emphasize that grammatical knowledge, knowledge of the language, again, could be implicit and or explicit knowledge, was not enough to communicate. We also need knowledge of language use. And that would be sociolinguistic or contextual competence. As Canale and Swain said, and I quote, "Focus on grammatical competence in the classroom is not a sufficient condition for the development of communicative competence." So what are the components of communicative competence? Just those two? Well, actually, Canale and Swain propose three components: grammatical competence, sociolinguistic competence, and strategic competence. Savignon added a fourth one, and that is discourse competence. So let's go one by one in no particular order. Grammatical competence refers to the knowledge of the linguistic system, the underlying rules. What is possible in a language, how the elements are combined, etc. Be careful, once again, we're not talking about explicit knowledge of rules. Being able to verbalize rules is not what we mean by grammatical competence. As Savignon says, a person demonstrates grammatical competence by using a rule, not by stating a rule. Another component of communicative competence is sociolinguistic competence. Our understanding of the social context, participants, functions, etc. To put it very, very simply, it refers to what is appropriate in a given context. Now, what is really appropriate? Who defines what is appropriate? That's even harder to describe than the linguistic system itself. There isn't a complete list of rules of what is appropriate when. We could say it's something we acquire and develop continuously through a variety of experiences. I personally love that Savignon says that it also involves when not to say anything, when to stay quiet. That's also part of sociolinguistic competence. All right, the third component, strategic competence. This is probably my favorite, and yes, I have a favorite competence, don't judge me. Strategic competence is about strategies to compensate for limitations in our knowledge. Things like circumlocution, avoidance, guessing, simplification, etc. And although it may be the case that we rely on these strategies with more frequency when we're starting to learn a new language, strategic competence applies to everyone, to all language users. It's not exclusive to beginner learners. Why? Because nobody knows everything. We all have limitations in our knowledge. Last but not least, discourse competence refers to the interpretation and expression of a global meaning that is always greater than the sum of the individual sentences. And that is a quote by Savignon. Discourse competence is about how the elements are interconnected to form this global meaning, and it can involve things like text coherence, use of cohesive devices, etc. And although I unpacked one by one in what appear to be a linear fashion, these four components are not linear. One does not lead to the other. Rather, the components interact with each other, and as they all develop, communicative competence develops. Also, one component is not more important than the other. They all form communicative competence. They all contribute equally. So, what about teaching? Can we teach communicative competence? I would say yes and no. If by teaching we mean telling students what to say when and how, well, that's not quite communicative competence. But communicative language teaching, CLT, aims to help students develop communicative competence. The origins of CLT were indeed about embracing all four components of communicative competence, and it was a reaction to traditional approaches where forms had to be mastered one at a time, and language was compartmentalized and typically presented in isolation, divorced from context, and separate from the communities of speakers. And this beautiful quote by Savignon says it best. It says, CLT is an approach that understands language to be inseparable from individual identity and social behavior. Not only does language define a community, but a community, in turn, defines the forms and uses of language. The importance of language in context is the common theme here. Communicative competence is not about mastering its individual components one at a time, and neither is language acquisition. So when it comes to teaching, language should be contextualized, not compartmentalized. There's still much more to unpack, so be sure to subscribe. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.